All right, we're going to take a little break here, and when we come back, a man's coming on whom you may recall. He's hosted Ark Midnight many times. He's Peter Barry Chowka. He'll be with us in a minute. That's right, the mighty Ark, the intelligence briefing, produced by Mary Fanning of theamericanreport.org. Now, let me tell you about a man. This is a man who has hosted Ark Midnight many times over the past years as we get ready to hit our 11th anniversary this coming February, which will get here pretty quick. And the man is Peter Barry Chowka. He is a veteran investigative journalist who's been working for 6 decades in a variety of media, both mainstream and alternative. In recent years, he's appeared regularly on BBC, radio, and television, the largest broadcaster in the world, to discuss and analyze political developments in the U.S. from a conservative perspective. Since 2007, he's published literally hundreds of articles and blogs at American Thinker. His article today is about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as President-elect Trump's new Health and Human Services Secretary, and you can read it at AmericanThinker.com, and you should. He's a great writer and a great thinker himself. A very great thinker, a rational man, as Robert Duvall said in the role of that German colonel. The eagle has landed. Well, the eagle has landed, and he is Peter Barry Chowka. Hey, Peter, welcome back to the program. It's great to talk to you again, man. It's been too long. It really has.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be with you again and with your audience. And you mentioned my previous guest hosting. And in fact, tonight, it's almost exactly 3 years since I guest hosted for the last time. And it's almost exactly 4 years since November 14th, 2020, when I guest hosted Ark Midnight for the first time. And so it feels like kind of a homecoming, but my God, what a difference 3 or 4 years makes in our lives now. I mean, that was a really dark time after the election of 2020 and for the next 3 3/4 years. But now feels like morning in America again, to borrow a phrase from Ronald Reagan's campaign of exactly 40 years ago, and I feel like there's a spring in my step, finally.
Yeah, it's given a lot of people some hope, which was much needed, and I hope that at some point, speaking of hope, that we'll get into this Chinese Communist Party, and its hooks are so deep into this country, you just can't believe it. But I think people should keep in mind that it is Biden took all this money, $1,065,000 in payments over a 3-month period in different bank accounts, and taking funds sourced to a CCP-linked company that wanted to advance China's interests, and all of this stuff is just insane. We should remember that this Chinese Communist Party is just not our enemy. It's a criminal enterprise. So anyway, what do you want to talk with us about tonight relative to what you've been reporting on lately?
Well, I've been working on a lot, writing a lot for American Thinker over the summer, and I have to take a small bow because before it was announced that J.D. Vance would be Trump's vice presidential choice, a source of mine very close to Trump, who I've nurtured over the past 5 years, told me that he would be the choice. So I published that at American Thinker, and according to Monica Showalter, who is an editor of American Thinker, she researched this later and said, I was the first one out of the gate in the United States to actually say Vance would be the vice president. And I don't pretend to have a crystal ball, but I do have good sources. But tonight I thought I'd like to talk about, kind of follow up what you mentioned about the collapse of cable news. And I like to put that in a big picture perspective. But also I'd like to talk a bit about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being appointed by President Trump to direct the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the largest department of the cabinet. It spends or is responsible for over $2 trillion, trillion with a T, of our spending annually, and that's about 2.5 times as much as military spending. So it is huge, and their decisions at that Health and Human Services touch every person in the United States personally. So, but first, let me just follow up what you were saying about the collapse of cable news. Now, I think we have witnessed in the last 11 days since the election and the comeback of Donald Trump, the most amazing comeback in the history of the American presidency. Not only a comeback, but it's possibly a sea change in politics and in life itself. For years, John, we've talked about this so many times, the left has been continuing its long march to power and has managed to expand its reach beyond the media into almost every aspect of our lives. Now, the exception to this came on November 5th, when the opinions of a majority of Americans finally held forth. They took advantage of the vote in our democratic republic, and the result was this enormous victory for Donald Trump, which, as you noted, has at least temporarily stopped this forward rush to the left, and it's actually backed the left into a corner now. And of course, the fight is not over, but it's on a very, very different level now, one where conservatives like us are dealing from a position of strength and of a mandate and not of weakness, responding to Biden and Obama 2.0. Now, in addition to the collapse of cable news left-wing channels like CNN and MSNBC. And by the way, the collapse is incredible. On election night, the ratings for broadcasting cable across the board were down 25% from 4 years ago, and they were down 45% from 2016. So approximately half as many people were watching broadcast and cable election coverage this year as 8 years ago. Although a lot of the people who went online to watch coverage did go to some cable and broadcast channels, and in particular Fox News. Fox News is the one exception to this cratering. Their ratings have gone up because conservatives identify it as the channel associated with Trump. Obviously, they're not perfect, but President Trump, I think, gave at least 36 interviews on Fox News in the last year, and he didn't do any place else in the mainstream media because they gave him pretty much a fair hearing, and they also covered most of his rallies, and they made room for his surrogates, Lara Trump, Don Jr., Eric Trump, and many, many others for the past year or two. So I've got to give them a lot of credit, although I have my qualms with some of their programming. But it's better to have them than not, let's say that. But it's also great to have the alternative media. And I was thinking of it in this way, this sea change we're facing now. In the past, at least since the 1940s, when broadcasting came about and went nationwide with the three networks who still exist, and in the 1980s when cable TV came on the scene, and of course CNN started in 1980, MSNBC and Fox started in 1996. Well, during all of this time, up until, I would say, very, very recently, this has been known as broadcasting, a word which came from what it sounds like, broadcasting, delivering the media to as broad an audience as possible, coast to coast, mainstream. Well, now the alternatives are coming into the fore, and I think we're soon approaching a day where online and podcasts and even shows like yours, Ark Midnight, Caravan to Midnight, which straddle both worlds of broadcasting and online, these are going to be the new broadcasting because it's where Americans are choosing to go as a primary source, not a secondary or a complementary source, but a primary source for news, information, and analysis because it's closer to the truth. And as we've seen in the last 4, 8, 10 years, the mainstream media is nothing but lies, damned lies.
That's right. I mean, I can't argue with that a bit. I mean, broadcasting, that's a farming expression where you reach your hand into the bag of seed and broadly cast it. That's what this is, and that's what, in fact, they do. Broadcasting is seed slinging, and what mainstream media has been doing is slinging and therefore planting the seeds of discord in the country, because a discordant country is much more malleable.
Well, they've been slinging something else, too, but I won't define that. And President Trump and the Republicans, I have to give them so much credit because Donald Trump and his surrogates and the Republican Party, which is largely directed by his daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, took full advantage of the alternative new media platforms. For example, Joe Rogan, when Trump went on there for 3 hours and it was watched by, what was the estimate, 150 million people or something?
Ridiculous numbers, huge.
Yeah. So finally, the Republicans got their act together. Now, we remember in 2008 and 2012, the rise of Obama, the Democrats and Obama got the better of the Republicans, and they had a new media strategy that was very effective, but no more. This year, the Democrats and Kamala's campaign had to pay for some more support among big names like Oprah and, the podcast they did, but they failed miserably because Kamala, I'm glad I don't have to give thought anymore to how to pronounce her name, but Kamala couldn't be dragged across the finish line, even though they spent $1 trillion trying. So there's so much to celebrate. I think you can detect that I'm in a very good mood tonight for the first time, first time since before the election, of course.
Yeah, I call her Skamala, but that's mean. Maybe not altogether tasteful, but I can't help it. I mean, I cannot believe that they... See, this is the thing that bothers me a little bit about this, Peter, and that is, sure, were they really so consumed with hubris that they thought that this, as one writer described it, cackling village idiot could actually become president of the United States? I mean, I realize for a bunch of leftist morons, this would be very stylish and quite wonderful. But did anybody seriously think she could win it?
Well, it worked before, Dylan. It worked with Obama. It worked with Clinton. I mean, there's a lot of ringers that they've run for president, in my opinion, who have nonetheless been, quote unquote, elected. But, I think they're just practiced liars. I mean, they don't believe this BS they're putting out there. I mean, Trump is Hitler. Trump is a fascist. And yet, a day or two ago, he was welcomed to the White House to sit down in a smiling exchange with President Joe Biden, and they met for 2 hours after that. And by all accounts, it was a cordial meeting. So, and Biden, of course, had basically implied Trump was a fascist, and Kamala said in her own words that he was a fascist. So they know they're lying, but they just couldn't put it over. But before we run out of time, I did want to get to RFK a bit because I've been following him. And, as you may recall, I spent a lot of my career focused on the medical industrial complex, trying to deconstruct that and look at the promising alternative non-toxic therapies for cancer and other diseases going back to the 1970s. And I spent about 3 decades focusing a lot of my work on that. Well, now, with the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to the cabinet to control this humongous agency of health and human services, which, as I said, touches all of our lives in major and minor ways, this is another sea change. I mean, it was 48 years ago, next January, that I reported on something called dietary goals, which was the result of a bipartisan nutrition committee of the U.S. Senate chaired by Democrat George McGovern and Republican Bob Dole. This gave, for the first time in history, government attention to the American diet's role in health and chronic deadly diseases like cancer. And before that, it was considered quackery to try to link diet with any disease. So this was a moment that really started the change, but it's taken 48 years to see that kind of awareness and everything that's happened since brought to center stage, which it can be now if RFK Jr. can get confirmed and will pull it off. Now, at the height of COVID, I did 3 interviews on Caravan to Midnight and Ark Midnight with Mary Holland, who's the CEO of Children's Health Defense, which is the 501c3 tax-exempt group that Bobby Kennedy Jr. set up, and he was the founder and the director at that point. And in each of these interviews about COVID, I thought, there's really nothing she's saying that I disagree with. And I knew that she and Bobby were coming more from the left politically. But at the conclusion of one of the episodes, I pointed out that their work seemed to me, that is Children's Health Defense and Bobby Kennedy and Mary Holland, it represented a common sense and common ground that was attracting both right and left. Now, 3 years later, Bobby and Trump have come together to work towards what they're calling MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, with the potential of actually uniting right and left. And there's actually precedent for this kind of optimism that I have now about this really bringing people together as one, as Americans. In the 1970s, polls showed that support for what was called medical freedom of choice, that is the right of Americans to use whatever treatments they wanted, if they got cancer or anything else. They could choose Laetrile, they could use vitamin C, they could choose anything that the establishment considered quackery, and they had the right to use it. And basically a whole bunch of states codified this into law at the time. Well, I think Kennedy and Trump coming together, from the early signs that I've seen around this huge area now, can mobilize that kind of support again, because it's common sense, John. It is common sense to look at your personal health and the health of the nation and say, we can do better, and I personally want to do better by making choices in my life, which, as we know, during COVID, we did not have. We were prevented from getting ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and then they pushed that deadly vaccine on us, the mandates, the mask mandates, none of which worked. It was all lies. It was all nonsense. It was not following the science. And the people following the science, of all people, were RFK Jr., his Children's Health Defense, and, of course, he wrote the definitive book on Anthony Fauci. It sold over 1 million copies. There's nothing out there like it. So he has had a sea change from all accounts. In fact, there was you mentioned Bill Maher earlier, who I can't stand either, but I happened to see a moment of his show tonight, repeated on CNN, and he had on a guest named Casey Means, MD, who was speaking on behalf of Bobby Kennedy in a one-on-one with Bill Maher. And she actually describing basically a holistic, or a view of holistic health, like I and my colleagues used to talk about and write about and speak about in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. She brought this up today, was saying this is what Bobby is into, and there's Bill Maher actually nodding along with her and agreeing with her at least part of the time. I mean, we've got the Los Angeles Times now saying their publisher was on Fox News yesterday saying they've got to put in conservatives on their paper now because the country is demanding it. Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, before the election wrote actually a very excellent op-ed when he ordered the paper not to endorse Kamala or anybody else, not to endorse a Democrat for the first time in modern history. And he went on the record saying the Post is going to have to change its act and start appealing to people who don't agree with the elites in Washington, D.C. Now, we'll see if they actually follow up, but they're making that noise now. They're making these sounds. They're expressing themselves, the left and the media and all these other fakers and liars, in a way that we'll see. I mean, we'll hold them to their word now. Are they going to actually follow up on this or not? And this comes as a result of Donald J. Trump. Thank God.
Yeah, really. How about Rand Paul getting ready to go after Anthony Fauci? Says he should go to prison for mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic and making, quote, the worst decision ever made by a public health official in the history of time regarding the origins of the deadly outbreak.
Well, Bobby Kennedy and Trump have promised to open the files on all these things, from the JFK assassination to COVID to UFOs to everything else. If we could just get the truth, the transparency on what went down in COVID, with Fauci largely running the show there, I think that bills will have to be paid, and he will be called to account for what I believe, in my opinion, were his crimes. And not only with COVID. If you look back on HIV/AIDS in the 1980s and 90s, that's when I first started reporting on Fauci in 1984, when he was head of the AIDS effort in the United States, which spent $1 trillion with a T, and now they have these drugs where you can take these drugs and not practice safe sex if you're a homosexual at $100,000 a year paid for by the government. That's part of Fauci's legacy. And then, of course, he allegedly cashes in because he owns part of the patents for these drugs that he and his colleagues helped to develop with our tax dollars. But, yeah, that's another thing, just transparency. Bobby Kennedy and, of course, President Trump, his boss, promised transparency. And, my article today at American Thinker, it can be read at AmericanThinker.com. It's in the center column 9 down from the top under blogs. I'd appreciate if people read it and go to my Twitter at @Chowka. I love to hear from people. But I get some comments there at American Thinker. I read them all, and people say, don't trust Bobby Kennedy. He's a leftist. This is a big mistake. Well, who's his boss? His boss is Donald J. Trump, President Trump, 47th president. If Bobby doesn't do what he expects him to do, Bobby's gone in a New York minute. So I have confidence in our new national leadership coming on January 20th, and in the cabinet he's selected. It could be a tough road for a few of them, but again, we'll pray for him and for them, and we'll see what happens. It's going to be a wild show between now and January 20th, and then for the next 4 years, and I can't wait.
Neither can I. It's going. I'll tell you what. It is not going to be boring, not at all. And the left is losing its mind so visibly. I think they've reached that point where nobody really takes them seriously anymore. It's almost as though they've had their run, and it's pretty much over with now because
John,
none of their
they don't have
ideas.
a leader. The Democratic Party, our number one adversary, let's say, other than Red China, foreign, the Democratic Party does not have a leader at this point. It can't be Kamala Harris. Obama's got to be his tail is between his legs now. He campaigned for her, and look what happened there. Who else is there? Maybe Hakeem Jeffries? I mean, good luck.
Right. If you go over to AmericanThinker.com, ladies and gentlemen, and just, as a matter of fact, go to the search engine of your choice, which I hope will be Yandex, because you'll get some actual results there that will be different from what you get at Google in many cases. He's got a bunch of articles there. His latest one, RFK Jr. as HHS Secretary can transform America, and failing cable news. That's another one. There was another big winner on Tuesday Election Day, Fox News, transcript. This is a fourth one. Obama's racism on full display as he spoke to Black Harris campaign workers in Pittsburgh yesterday. And another one, hell froze over yesterday as Tim Walz sat for a live interview on Fox News. And what a scream it was. Oh. Final message of the world, as long as it doesn't take more than about 20 seconds, Peter.
John, it's a pleasure to be with you again, and we've got a front row seat for the next 4 years, and it's going to be really far out.
Well, let's stay in closer touch. I enjoy our talks always, and I look forward to your next it wouldn't be an appearance, but a presence on the program. That's okay. All right,
Thank
God
you very
bless,
much,
Peter.
John.
You're most welcome. Peter Barry Chowka, everybody. All right, stand by. More to come. Jack Maxey's next on the Ark.